They almost turned him away at the door, and for a moment, it looked like this would be the night Ethan Cole finally stopped believing in second chances. The hostess glanced at his worn jacket, his scuffed boots, and said, "Sir, this is a formal dining space." And a couple nearby exchanged quiet smirks. But Ethan didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just gave a small nod and said, "I understand," like a man who had learned that dignity didn't need to raise its voice to be real. The soft glow of the restaurant lights reflected off polished marble floors. The low hum of conversation floated through the air. Glasses clinked gently, and somewhere in the distance, a piano played something slow and familiar, and Ethan stood there for half a second longer than most would, not out of pride, but out of habit, like he was deciding whether to stay or quietly walk away. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded confirmation for the reservation, and handed it over without a word. The hostess hesitated, scanned it, and her expression shifted just slightly. Not respect, not yet, but enough to step aside and let him in. And as he walked past the tables filled with tailored suits and polished smiles, he could feel the weight of eyes that measured worth in dollars and appearances. But he kept his shoulders relaxed, his pace steady, because tonight wasn't about them. It was about a promise he had made earlier that morning. "Just one more, Daddy," his daughter had asked, her small voice hopeful but careful, like she didn't want to ask for too much. And he had smiled, the kind of smile that carried more exhaustion than joy, and said, "Yeah, sweetheart, just one more," not because he believed in it, but because she did, and sometimes that was enough. The waiter guided him to a table near the center of the room, a place where everyone could see and be seen, and Ethan sat down, folding his hands loosely, not checking his phone, not fidgeting, just waiting, calm, quiet, present, the kind of stillness that didn't demand attention but slowly earned it. And then the doors opened again, and everything changed. Heels clicked against the floor with sharp precision. Conversations softened mid-sentence, and a subtle shift moved through the room like a current. Victoria Hale had arrived, and even before anyone said her name, people knew, because power doesn't need introductions. It carries itself. She stepped inside with composed confidence, her presence effortless, her gaze scanning the room with practiced clarity. And then it landed on him, and for a brief second, something unreadable crossed her face. Not surprise, not quite disappointment, but close enough to both. And in that quiet moment between expectation and reality, no one in that room realized they were about to witness something they wouldn't forget, because dignity, when tested, doesn't break, it reveals. And tonight, it would reveal everything in silence. Victoria did not sit down right away. She stood there for a breath longer than necessary, studying him with the kind of quiet calculation that had built empires and ended negotiations in seconds. And then she said, "Ethan," her voice smooth, controlled. And he looked up, meeting her eyes without hesitation. "That is me," he replied, simple, steady, no attempt to impress, no attempt to apologize for who he was. And something about that lack of performance unsettled her more than arrogance ever could. She took her seat slowly, placing her phone face down on the table, a small gesture that did not go unnoticed by the people watching from a distance. Because when someone like Victoria Hale chose to be present, it meant something. The waiter approached, offering menus with rehearsed politeness. "Can I start you both with something too?" "Drink?" he asked, and Victoria answered without looking. "Sparkling water," while Ethan nodded and said, "Just regular water is fine." And there it was, that quiet contrast, not spoken, not emphasized, but felt like two different worlds sitting across from each other. The silence stretched for a moment, not awkward, but uncertain, like both of them were deciding what version of themselves to bring into the conversation. "I almost did not come," Victoria said finally, her tone honest, but edged. And Ethan gave a small nod. "That makes two of us," he replied, and she raised an eyebrow slightly, not expecting that answer. "Then why did you?" she asked, leaning back just enough to observe him more closely. And he paused, not for effect, but because he was choosing his words carefully, "Because someone I care about still believes people can surprise you," he said, and there was no smile when he said it, just truth. And for a second, something in her expression softened before she caught it and pulled it back behind practiced composure. The waiter returned with their drinks, the soft clink of glass against table filling the space between them. And around them, the restaurant continued its quiet performance of wealth and status. But at that table, something slower was beginning to unfold. "You do not seem like someone who goes on blind dates," she said, tilting her head slightly, and he let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "I do not," he admitted. "This is my first and probably my last." And she studied him again, this time not for flaws, but for something harder to define: authenticity, maybe, or the absence of pretense. "You say that like you have already decided the outcome," she said. And he looked at her, not defensive, not hopeful, just present. "No," he replied quietly. "I say that because I have learned not to expect more than what is real." And that answer did something the expensive setting could not. It shifted the air just slightly, like the beginning of a change no one else in the room could yet see. Because while others measured success in numbers and titles, what sat across from her now was something rarer, a man who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. And Victoria Hale, for the first time that evening, found herself listening not out of obligation, but out of curiosity, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that grows in silence. The menu lay untouched between them as the quiet settled deeper, not uncomfortable, but revealing, like a mirror neither of them expected to face. And Victoria finally leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now. "What do you do, Ethan?" she asked, and he answered without hesitation. "I fix things," and she gave a faint smile, the kind that usually preceded dismissal. "That is a broad description," she said, and he nodded. "Cars. Mostly. Sometimes whatever else people cannot afford to replace." And there was no shame in his tone, only clarity, and something about that steadiness made her pause before responding. "You seem content with that," she said, testing the word as if it did not quite fit the world she knew, and he glanced down at the table for a brief second before meeting her eyes again. "Content is not the same as easy," he replied, and the simplicity of that answer landed heavier than anything more elaborate could have. The waiter returned, asking if they were ready to order. Victoria chose quickly, something refined, practiced, while Ethan closed the menu and said, "Just the burger is fine." And again, the contrast was there, quiet but undeniable. Yet this time, it did not feel like distance. It felt like truth. And as the waiter left, a sudden commotion stirred near the far side of the dining room. A tray slipped, glasses shattered against the floor, and a young server froze in place, clearly overwhelmed. A manager's sharp voice cutting through the hum. "Watch what you are doing." And heads turned, some with irritation, others with mild amusement. But Ethan did not look annoyed. He simply stood, calm, steady, and crossed the room before anyone else moved. "Hey, it is all right," he said gently, crouching just enough to meet the server's eye level without making it a spectacle. "Accidents happen." And his voice carried something rare in that room, respect without condition. The server nodded, flustered but grateful, and Ethan began helping gather what could be safely moved aside. Not as a gesture, not for attention, but because it needed to be done. And for a moment, the room hesitated, unsure how to respond, because kindness like that did not fit the rhythm of the place. Back at the table, Victoria watched closely, her expression no longer guarded, but thoughtful. And when Ethan returned, brushing his hands lightly, he did not explain, did not look for acknowledgement. He simply sat down as if nothing unusual had happened, and she studied him in silence for a second longer before asking, "Why did you do that?" And he tilted his head slightly, almost confused by the question. "Because he needed help," he said, and there was no deeper explanation, no performance, just truth. And that was the moment something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Because in a room full of people trying to be seen, the man across from her had done something no one else had thought to do, and then returned to his seat without expecting anything in return. And for the first time that night, Victoria Hale was no longer measuring him. She was beginning to understand him, and in that quiet realization, the distance between their worlds grew just a little smaller. Though neither of them said it out loud, the food arrived, carefully plated, precise, everything in its place, but neither of them reached for it right away. because something unspoken had already begun to matter more than the meal itself, and Victoria adjusted her glass slightly. Her voice quieter now, less guarded. "You did not have to do that," she said, referring to the server. And Ethan shrugged lightly. "No one has to do most things," he replied, "but it still matters." And she held his gaze a second longer than before, as if trying to understand the simplicity of a man who did not calculate every move. "You are different," she said, not as a compliment, not yet, but as an observation she could not ignore, and he gave a small, almost amused breath. "That is one way to put it," he answered, picking up his glass, his movements steady, unhurried, and across the room. The earlier incident had not fully disappeared, the manager now whispering sharply to the same young server, frustration clear in his posture, and a few nearby guests exchanged quiet comments, subtle, dismissive, the kind that carried more judgment than volume. Victoria noticed it, her expression tightening slightly, because she recognized that tone. She had used it before in boardrooms where mistakes were measured in millions. But here, it felt different, smaller, and somehow heavier. "People expect perfection in places like this," she said, almost to herself. And Ethan looked toward the scene briefly before returning his attention to her. "People expect control," he corrected gently, "but life does not always work that way." And there was no challenge in his voice, just perspective, and she leaned back slightly, absorbing that control is how things get built, she said, her tone firm again, instinct returning, and he nodded, acknowledging her world without resisting it. "And sometimes it is how things break," he added quietly, and that landed not loudly, but enough to shift something behind her eyes. The conversation paused again, but this time it was not uncertain. It was reflective, like both of them were standing at the edge of something neither had planned. And then a man from a nearby table stood, his suit sharp, his confidence louder than necessary. "Some people just are not cut out for places like this," he muttered, not directly to them, but not quietly either, his glance clearly aimed at Ethan. And a few low chuckles followed, the kind that hide behind politeness. And for a brief moment, everything seemed to wait, the air tightening just enough for a reaction, for a defense, for something, but Ethan did not rise to it. He did not respond. He simply took a slow sip of his water and set the glass back down with quiet precision, his expression unchanged, his posture steady, and that silence did more than any argument could have, because it did not give the moment power, it absorbed it. And across from him, Victoria watched closely, expecting at least a flicker of irritation, but there was none, only calm, only dignity. And for the first time, she realized something she had not expected to feel tonight. Respect, not for what he had, not for what he could offer, but for what he refused to become, and in that quiet refusal, the balance of the room shifted ever so slightly, though most had not yet noticed, but she had, and that was enough. The man's comment lingered in the air like a stain no one wanted to acknowledge, but everyone had heard, and for a moment, the room held its breath, waiting for Ethan to respond, to defend himself, to prove something, but he did none of that. Instead, he reached for his fork, took a small bite of his food, and nodded once, as if to himself, calm, unshaken, and that quiet choice did something unexpected. It made the insult feel smaller, almost misplaced, and Victoria noticed it. Immediately, the way power can shift without noise, the way presence can outweigh status, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice lower now, more personal. "Does that not bother you?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for any crack in the calm. And Ethan paused, not to think of an answer, but to decide how honest he wanted to be. "It used to," he said, setting his fork down gently. "Back when I thought people had to understand me for me to have value." And she held his gaze, something in her expression softening again. "And now?" she asked, quieter than before, and he gave a faint, almost tired smile. "Now I know they do not," he replied, and there was no bitterness in it, just acceptance, and that landed deeper than any argument could have, because it was not defensive, it was resolved. And for the first time that night, Victoria found herself without a prepared response. Her world had always been about proving, about earning, about being seen at the highest level, and yet the man across from her was sitting in complete stillness, untouched by the very thing most people chased, validation. And it unsettled her in a way she could not immediately explain. Across the room, the same man who had made the comment shifted uncomfortably, perhaps expecting a reaction that never came, perhaps realizing too late that his words had not landed the way he intended, and the quiet around Ethan seemed to grow, not louder, but stronger, like something steady and immovable. "You are not what I expected," Victoria admitted, her voice almost a whisper now, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, not surprised. "That makes two of us," he said, echoing his earlier words, but this time there was something warmer behind them, something that had not been there before, and she let out a small breath, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. "I spend most of my time around people who are trying to be more than they are," she said slowly, as if realizing it while speaking, and he nodded once, understanding without needing explanation. "That gets exhausting," he said, and she gave a quiet, almost reluctant laugh. "It does." And for a brief moment, the space between them no longer felt like a divide, but like a bridge, something fragile, something new. And then her phone buzzed softly against the table, the screen lighting up with a name that carried weight, authority, expectation. She glanced at it, just for a second, before turning it face down again without answering, and Ethan noticed not the name but the choice, and he said nothing, because some decisions did not need commentary. They spoke for themselves, and in that small, quiet act, something shifted once more because, for the first time that evening, Victoria Hale had chosen presence over power, and across from her sat a man who had been doing that all along, without needing anyone to notice, and somehow that made all the difference. The room had settled into a quieter rhythm, but something beneath the surface was beginning to shift, subtle at first, like the calm before. A change no one could quite name, and then it happened again, not loud, not dramatic, but enough. The same man from earlier leaned back in his chair, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard. "You can always tell who does not belong," he said, swirling his drink slowly. And this time, there was no mistaking who he meant. A few people glanced over, curious, some amused, others uncomfortable, and the attention returned to Ethan's table like a spotlight no one had asked for. Victoria's posture stiffened slightly, not out of embarrassment, but out of awareness. She had spent years in rooms like this. She knew exactly how quickly perception could turn into judgment. "You do not have to stay," she said quietly, her voice measured but sincere. "We can leave." And for the first time, there was something protective in her tone, something that had not been there before, but Ethan shook his head gently. "No," he said, calm as ever. "I am exactly where I need to be." And the simplicity of that answer grounded the moment in a way nothing else could. The man across the room let out a soft laugh, louder now, more confident in his audience. "Some people mistake stubbornness for confidence," he added, and this time a few more voices joined in, not cruel but careless, the kind of laughter that comes from people who have never had to question their place. And again, the room waited, but not for Ethan this time, for something else, something different. And then it came, not from him, but from the unexpected. The manager approached their table, his expression tight, controlled. "Sir," he began, looking directly at Ethan, "we do have a certain standard here." And the implication hung in the air, unfinished but understood. Victoria's eyes sharpened instantly, the shift in her presence immediate. But before she could speak, Ethan looked up, meeting the manager's gaze with the same quiet steadiness he had carried all night. "I understand," he said, his tone respectful, unshaken, "and I am not here to lower it." And there was no challenge in his voice, no defiance, just truth. And something about that response made the manager hesitate, just for a second, because it did not fit the script. It did not escalate. It did not retreat. It simply stood, calm and undeniable. The manager cleared his throat. "Uncertain now, of course," he said, stepping back. And as he walked away, the energy in the room shifted again, quieter this time, more aware, because something had just happened that did not rely on power, money, or status. It relied on something else entirely. And across from him, Victoria watched with a depth of focus she had not shown all evening. Her expression no longer guarded, no longer calculating, but present, fully present, because in a world where people fought to be seen, the man in front of her had just held his ground without raising his voice, without demanding respect. And somehow, he had earned it anyway. And in that quiet moment, the laughter that had once filled the room began to fade, replaced by something far more powerful. Silence. The silence did not break all at once. It settled, deeper, heavier, like the room itself was learning something it could not unlearn. And for the first time that evening, no one laughed, no one whispered. They simply watched, and Ethan did not acknowledge it. He did not look around to measure the change. He simply returned to his meal, calm, grounded, as if none of it had ever been about them in the first place. And that was when it happened, the moment no one expected. Victoria reached for her glass, paused, then set it down again without taking a sip, her eyes fixed on him with a clarity that had nothing to do with business, nothing to do with control. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, her voice steady but different, now stripped of its earlier distance. And Ethan looked at her, not confused, not impressed, just attentive. "I know your name," he said. That seemed enough. And something in that answer landed deeper than she anticipated, because most people in that room would have listed her titles, her companies, her influence. But he had chosen the simplest truth, and for a brief moment, she let out a quiet breath, almost like relief. "I am the CEO of Hale Dynamics," she said, not to impress him, but to reveal something real, something she had not planned to say tonight. And a ripple moved through the nearby tables as the words reached ears that understood their weight. A few heads turned, subtle but immediate, because power had just been named out loud. And yet Ethan's expression did not change, not even slightly. He nodded once, acknowledging her words the same way he had acknowledged everything else, with calm respect, but without shifting who he was. "That sounds like a lot of responsibility," he said, and there was no awe in his tone, only recognition. And that was the moment everything shifted again, not in the room, but in her, because for the first time in a very long time, someone had heard what she said without attaching anything to it. No expectation, no advantage, no calculation, just understanding. And she leaned back slightly, studying him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "Most people react differently," she admitted, and he gave a small nod. "Most people are trying to gain something," he replied, and she held his gaze, her voice softer now, almost reflective. "And you are not?" she asked, and he paused, just long enough to make the answer matter. "No," he said, "I already have what I need." And there it was, simple, quiet, undeniable. And around them, the room felt different now, not louder, not softer, but aware, because the balance had shifted in a way no one had expected. The man who had been underestimated was no longer being measured, and the woman who held power had just revealed it without changing him at all. And in that quiet exchange, something rare had taken shape. Not dominance, not admiration, but something deeper, respect. And it did not need to be announced. It was already there, filling the silence where judgment used to be. The words had settled, not just on the table between them, but across the entire room. And for the first time that evening, no one was pretending not to listen, because something real had replaced the performance. And Victoria sat there for a moment longer, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of her glass, her usual certainty replaced by something quieter, something more human. "I built everything by making sure I was never overlooked," she said slowly, not as a statement of pride, but as a truth she had carried for years. And Ethan nodded, not interrupting, not reshaping her words, just allowing them to exist. "And did it work?" he asked gently, and she let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "It worked," she said, but it did not leave much room for anything else. And the honesty of that moment did not need explanation. It filled the space between them with something neither had expected to find tonight. And across the room, the earlier voices had gone quiet. The man who had once laughed now sat still, his attention no longer casual, because the balance had shifted in a way he could not control. And back at the table, Ethan leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed, but his presence steady. "You do not have to be one thing forever," he said, his tone calm, not instructing, not advising, just offering perspective. And she looked at him, really looked this time, as if trying to understand how someone who had so little by her world standards could carry so much clarity. "That is not how my world works," she replied, though her voice held less certainty than before, and he gave a small nod. "Maybe not," he said, "but that does not mean it is the only way." And again, there was no pressure in his words, only possibility. And that was what made it land, because it did not demand change. It allowed it. The waiter returned quietly, clearing plates that had barely been touched, the soft clink of dishes the only sound breaking the stillness. And as he stepped away, Victoria reached for her phone again, the screen lighting up with missed calls, messages, decisions waiting for her. And she looked at it for a moment longer than necessary, before turning it off completely and placing it aside, not face down this time, but fully away. And Ethan noticed not the gesture itself, but what it meant, the choice to be here fully without distraction, without control. And he said nothing, because some choices deserved silence. And she leaned forward slightly, her voice quieter now, but stronger in a different way. "I was not expecting this," she admitted. And he gave a faint smile, the first one that reached his eyes. "Neither was I," he replied. And there was a pause, not empty, but full, like something had settled in a place that neither of them needed to name. And around them, the room had changed, not because of who they were, but because of what had just happened. The laughter had disappeared, the judgment had softened, replaced by something else. Entirely awareness, respect, and a kind of quiet that did not come from discomfort, but from understanding, because sometimes the strongest moment in a room is not when someone proves their worth, but when they never needed to. And in that silence, everyone had seen it. Even if they did not yet know how to explain it, the night did not end with applause. It did not end with grand gestures or declarations. It ended the way truth often does, quietly, with something understood rather than spoken. And as the waiter placed the check gently on the table, neither of them reached for it right away, not out of hesitation, but because the moment itself had become more important than anything that could be paid for. And Victoria looked at it briefly before sliding it aside, her attention returning to Ethan with a calm she had not felt in years. "I think I was wrong about tonight," she said, her voice steady but softer than it had been when she first arrived. And he gave a small nod, not asking what she meant, not needing clarification, because some realizations did not require explanation. "Most nights are not what we expect," he replied, his tone warm, grounded. And she held his gaze for a second longer, as if committing something to memory. Not his face, not his words, but the feeling of being seen without expectation. And across the room, people had begun to return to their conversations, but quieter now, more aware, as if something had shifted in the way they measured what mattered. And the man who had once laughed no longer spoke at all, his silence heavier than any comment he had made earlier, because now he understood, even if he could not say it. And back at the table, Ethan finally reached for the check, but before he could open it, Victoria placed her hand gently over it. Not forceful, not commanding, just present. "Let me," she said. And he looked at her, not resisting, but not immediately agreeing either. And then he smiled faintly. "We can split it," he replied. And there was something in that choice, something balanced, something equal. And she paused for a brief second before nodding, accepting it, not because she had to, but because she understood what it meant. Respect does not take more than it gives. And as they stood, the chair legs moving softly against the floor, there was no rush, no urgency, just a shared stillness that followed them toward the door. And as they stepped outside, the night air was cool, quiet, untouched by the expectations of the room they had left behind, the city lights stretching out in soft lines across the street. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything important had already been said in silence. "So," Victoria began, her voice lighter now, but sincere, "was this really your last date?" And Ethan looked out toward the street for a second before answering, his expression calm, but different now. "I thought it would be," he said, then turned back to her. "But I have been wrong before." And that was it. No promise, no certainty, just possibility. And she smiled, not the practiced smile the world expected from her, but something quieter, something real. "Good," she said. And as they stood there, neither rushing to leave, neither trying to control what came next. The world around them continued as it always had, but something between them had changed, something steady, something unspoken, and somewhere behind them, inside that restaurant, the room that had once measured worth and appearances had learned, even if only for a moment, that the strongest presence does not demand attention. It earns silence, and sometimes that silence is where everything begins.